Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the book, The CEO, The Rise and Fall of Britain's Captains of Industry by Michael Aldous and John Turner. My name is Gaia Narciso. I'm a professor in economics at Trinity College Dublin, and this event is part of the outreach activities of the Centre of Excellence in Economics, History and Policy, which is a center funded by the Higher Education Authority under the North-South Research Program. The Centre is a cross-border initiative between Trinity College Dublin and Queen's University Belfast. In fact, John and I are the two co-directors of the Centre. I welcome all of you here today. And I'm delighted to have Tom Lyons today with us. And we thought it would be fitting to have a CEO for the launch of a book about CEOs. And indeed, Tom Lyons is the co-founder and CEO of The Currency, is an award-winning journalist who has covered Irish business and economics for the past 2 decades. He worked with the Sunday Business Post, the Sunday Times, and the Irish Times. He's the author of 2 best-selling books and has been named Ireland's Business and Economics Journalist of the Year on 3 different occasions. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Tom, who will chair the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gaia. It's a real pleasure to be here as a graduate in great honor. Economics in Trinity College. I feel like talking to the Centre is a great honor. I am, as you said, also a CEO, unfortunately not yet a fat cat. And certainly reading the book and hearing about some of the salaries, you start getting ideas above your station. The book is a fantastic book, and one of the things that really jumped out at me is like the journey of the CEO over the past 100 years. We had a quiz of business journalists last week where one of the questions is, who is the highest paid CEO of an Irish headquartered public company? And most people went with Jim Minturn, the CEO of CEPH, or they thought, Michael O'Leary, isn't he getting a big bonus? Maybe it's him. It's actually Peter Jackson, who is the CEO of Flutter Entertainment and the owner of Paddy Power. He got paid 19 million last year versus 7 million the previous year, which is why people kind of missed it, because we hadn't noticed his income had tripled in the space of a year. But that said, he's running a company with a market cap of nearly $50 billion, and every month he's got 14 million people gambling on his website. If you compare that to when the company IPO'd in 2000, we had Stuart Kenny was the CEO then, and he was paid, he had to survive on a piddling $500,000 a year. And he was somebody who had only 6,000 online customers. He was mainly running shops. So when you think about that story, where you see Stuart Kenny, building the business up, going through some very hard times, getting into Buddhism, moving to Tibet, lashing out at the evils of gambling, having become a millionaire out of it, versus Jackson, who is this guy, he's an engineer. There's quite a few of them in the book. As the book goes on, he's somebody a management consultant, even worse, came from McKinsey. And he is somebody who is making a ton of money. And I think that the book answers a lot of questions about those 2 life stories, and the story of the people who came before gambling formalized, where you see people who go on very different journeys. And the book looks at how CEOs of different businesses change over time. What lessons can we learn from them? What are the trends? Are they worth it? There's a lot of very interesting questions asked by both Michael Aldous and John Turner, who are both here with us today. They have written a brilliant book about the CEO, the rise and fall of Britain's captains of industry, and they're going to give a talk at the start to take us through the background to the book and some of its key findings. Over to you guys. Brilliant.
Well, thank you so much, Gaia and Tom, for the kind words. Welcome, everybody. So we're delighted to be here today to talk a little bit about the book. And what we're going to plan to do, myself and John, we're going to talk for about 35 minutes and then take some questions. So we don't want to bore you with the academic minutiae of the study that is behind the book, and I can promise you there is not going to be any regression tables, which may be a disappointment to some of our economics friends here in the room, but for everybody else that'll be a real relief. But we do want to assure you that the book is based on some very serious academic research. It seems like an age ago now that John and myself got a grant from the Leverhulme Trust to build a database of British CEOs of the top 100 biggest publicly traded companies. So 100 biggest companies, market capitalization between 1900 and 2009. And in building that database, we have about 450 companies in it, and we found about 1,400 CEOs. Now, for every CEO, we then built a biography. So we have their education, their career experiences, details about their family, and other networks they were involved in. And because we were gluttons for punishment, we then went out and found performance data, different kinds of performance data, for all of the companies over the whole period. And what we have tried to do with this book is to summarize what we found by looking at this data, and we ask 4 questions. And these are the 4 questions that really motivate the book. Who gets to the top? How do they get there? What do they do when they are in the role of CEO? And how do they affect the performance of the companies that they lead? And these are the 4 trends and the 4 sort of big questions that we take through this study of the 20th century. And by doing this and answering these questions, what we have also tried to do is then think about the impact of this corporate elite on the British economy, on British society and politics. So what we're going to do now is talk you through what we think are 7 of the key lessons that we've learned and that we think are really important issues for academics, policymakers, corporate decision makers, and an informed general public to think about when they think about CEOs, the role, and who inhabits it. Now, first and perhaps most critically of all, we want to get you to think that CEOs really matter. These are highly important individuals in our economy and society. And we start with the story of this man here. If you don't know who this is Sir Martin Sorrell. He was the longtime CEO of the advertising giant WPP. He's now chairman of S4 Capital. And after a highly successful career as the money man for the ad agency Saatchi & Saatchi, in 1985, Sorrell bought a controlling share in a small listed company, Wire and Plastic Products. Now, Wire and Plastic Products was a very small manufacturer of supermarket baskets. So this is the strange origin story of WPP, one of the world's biggest advertising agencies. That's how it starts out. Over 30 years, Sorrell would transform this manufacturing company to become this enormous advertising marketing agency. This involved, when he left in 2018, by that point he'd integrated around 400 other advertising and related agencies into the company through mergers and takeovers. It employed about 130,000 people in 112 countries with revenues of around £115 billion a year. That's a phenomenal growth story. This is one of the great success stories of the modern British economy. Along the way, he was famously described as an odious little shit. One of the executives of the companies that he acquired said he would rather lick an abattoir floor than work for Sorrell. And of course, on his exit, which was highly acrimonious, and please note the use of the word allegedly, for those of you of a more legalistic bent in the room, this involved claims of bullying, misuse of company funds, and this is what paved the way then for his departure from the company that he had founded. And this for us is a really critical conundrum at the heart of the book. CEOs really matter because when they get it right, they can achieve extraordinarily important outcomes for society. Innovation, improving productivity, creating jobs, but when they get it wrong, they destroy value. They destroy companies, and they destroy people. Now, these stats, I think, are important in giving some context about the scale of the role they play, and this is in British society. These are quite recent numbers from the last couple of years. Britain's top 100 companies, they employ around 6% of the total workforce. They contribute in the region of 13% of total tax revenues, that's including PAYE. And each of these companies supports somewhere in the region of 6,000 other businesses in their supply chains. Therefore, the person running these companies wields significant economic power. We have also calculated, this isn't in the book, this is in some other work we're doing at the moment, that on average across the century, the CEO as an individual accounts for about 10% of company performance, good and bad. These are enormously consequential individuals, and therefore we should spend more time thinking about who they are and what they do. Now, an interesting sort of fact which we talk about throughout the book is how the role of the CEO has changed. And one of the ways we do this is looking at the titles that are used to describe the most senior executives within companies. And what we see at the beginning of the century is that there are two titles that are used. One is chairman, and the other is managing director. And this is actually quite an interesting representation of how corporate power changes over time, because in many ways this represented a split in executive authority within companies. The chairman, elected from amongst the shareholders, head of the board, often in charge of big strategic decisions, a managing director, appointed to run the company on a day-to-day basis. And this actually represented a split in authority and power. Across the century, we start to see the first use of the term CEO as a designation in the 1930s. But this gradually becomes much more prominent over time, and so by the 1980s, this is the dominant term used to describe the most senior executive in companies. But what this represents is the consolidation of authority and power within a single, all-powerful executive. And this is the dominant model of control we now have within large companies in the UK, and particularly in the US as well. CEOs matter more today because they have become more powerful. These are now the single dominant source of authority and power within these large companies. And this is going to be an issue that we're going to return to later in the talk when we think about issues around governance. Our second lesson is about social mobility. Now, who gets to the top of the corporate ladder can tell us a lot about opportunities for social mobility in our society. Is this a closed cadre, dominated in the UK by Etonians, Oxbridge graduates, or can Barrow boys, the people who start as clerks in the post room, can they make their way to the top? Now, anecdotally in the UK, there is a tendency to see the British economic elite as synonymous with its social elite. Now, the chap here who we've used to represent this sort of very common belief, this is Viscount Churchill, Victor Spencer in his pomp, and the clue to his social background is in the name Spencer. So Diana Spencer, the late Princess of Wales, he comes from this aristocratic family. Now, Spencer, he was the Page of Honour to Queen Victoria, he went to Eton, he then went to Sandhurst. He was the Lord Chamberlain at Edward VII's coronation. His social titles go on and on and on. But also, perhaps surprisingly, and with seemingly no business experience whatsoever, he was also the chairman for quite a number of years in the 1910s and into the 1920s of the Great Western Railway, one of Britain's largest and most important railway companies, one of its largest listed companies. So he's quite emblematic of this widespread view that British business has been dominated by aristocratic amateurs. Social elites, no business experience, who, due to their social connections, get to run large parts of the economy. But what we've actually found, and when we look at this data, is that although there may have been some truth at this towards the back end of the 19th century, even by the early 20th century, this had begun to change. Those from the elite, the social elite, peers of the realm, members of the aristocracy, in terms of being CEOs, were in steady decline. What we actually find instead is that business was a social elevator. Those were being raised to the peerage. Business was enabling people to come from very humble backgrounds. So here we look at people like Thomas Lipton, who was born in the Gorbals of Glasgow to very poor Irish parents who had moved there. William Lever, stolidly middle-class Northern English boy who would rise up simply through their business success and were raised to the peerage. So in actual fact, even from early in the 20th century, business was acting as a social elevator. We also find there was a rapid rise in promotion to the top due to meritocratic measures. The number or the proportion of CEOs who were actually rising to that role without being a member of the social elite, without having a family connection to the business, would rise quite dramatically from the 1930s. So that the majority of people who were rising to the top of the corporate ladder were getting there due to meritocratic means. And what we actually see is in the years after World War II, we see a significant rise in the number of individuals from working class backgrounds who make it to the top of the corporate ladder. Now, this is a really nice example. This gentleman here is Leonard Lord. He was the CEO of Austin Motors, and then the British Motor Corporation in the 1950s and into the early 1960s. His father had been an attendant at the local public baths. He went to his local school, which he was very lucky because it actually had a really good technical curriculum. And due to his academic ability, and this is in the 1920s, he stayed on at school until he was age 16. This was really quite unusual in the 1920s, when most boys from working class backgrounds would have already been out into the world of work from 12 or 13. But from the age of 16, he developed extensive practical engineering experience at a number of engineering and automotive companies, and he worked his way up from the shop floor to the top of Britain's biggest automobile company. And he's far from unique. So this is data we look at from the 1950s, in the post-war period, the 1950s and 1960s, and what we actually see is that a significant proportion of CEOs of the largest companies had left school with very little formal education. Now, we also see many who start as industrial apprentices or start in the mailroom effectively. So that's what we classify as boys, and they are all boys in this period, who start off as clerks, often in these sort of like clerking jobs, often in banks and insurance companies. So a significant proportion of British CEOs were actually able to come up from, working class backgrounds and work their way up due to these roles. Now, this actually represents, if we compare this to the US and compare this to US data, we see actually probably more social mobility amongst Britain's corporate elite than we do amongst America's corporate elite at the same time. If you look at similar studies and similar data from the US, Britain does seem to have more social mobility through business. So this is actually a lived British reality, the idea of being able to get to the top of the corporate ladder wherever you come from, rather than the archetypal American dream. But of course, for 50% of Britain's population, the world of big business and corporations provided no social mobility whatsoever. Now, in our study of over 1,400 CEOs between 1900 and 2009, how many women do you think are in our sample? 50? 6? That's getting much closer. Oh, even closer. Yeah, so we have 3. 3. So when we submitted our first draft, our editor came back and said, I think you've got a diversity problem. We scratched our head and we thought, well, that is history. We can't change that. However, we took that point on board, and it is a really important point, and we actually then went away and we started to think more deeply about the role that women played in the corporate economy, and we wanted to think about why this had taken so long. And so as we began to think about this, we looked at who these CEOs were. This is Marjorie Scardino on the left with Theresa May. Marjorie Scardino is the first woman with the CEO designation of a FTSE 100 company, and that was Pearson in 1997. On the bottom right is Cynthia Carroll. She became CEO of Anglo American, the huge mining company, in 2007. And there is a feature of both these women that perhaps sheds some light on this. They're both American. In fact, the first 3 women CEOs in the FTSE 100 were all American. Why? Now, one reason we think that possibly explains this is that gender discrimination laws had changed a decade earlier in the US to the UK, so there was gender discrimination laws passed in the 1960s that would not come into force in the UK until the 1970s. And we think that this began to change mindsets, and it also began to sort of encourage women in roles and ready to step. That meant that there were women in very senior corporate roles and ready to step into these roles, but they were predominantly coming out of the American corporate economy. And this doesn't necessarily, frustratingly, this shouldn't have happened. There were many brilliant women in the British corporate economy. This is one. The lady sat down signing the petition is called Margaret Hay Thomas, Viscountess Rhondda. Now, in the 1910s and 1920s, she was on the board of 33 companies. She was the chairman of 7. She had founded a publication called Time and Tide that would run for decades. She was the first female president of the Institute of Directors in 1926. She founded the Efficiency Club, which was there to promote women's role in business in the 1920s. There were figureheads there who were trying to open pathways for women in the British economy much earlier in the century. Why did this not happen? Probably, we think, because of cultural attitudes and legislation, this simply made it very difficult. Now, this has begun to change, and there has been, although it's been inordinately slow, there has been progress. So if we look, certainly from sort of the turn of the century, the proportion of women on boards has risen. The actual number of CEOs is still relatively low. So currently, I think there's 9 female CEOs in the FTSE 100. We actually think this number will rise in the next decade. And we think there's actually some mechanics here that is just simply going to make this happen, in part because one way of thinking about this is the length of time it takes to train and create people who can reach these roles and fill the pipelines. And we estimate that it's about 30 to 35 years in terms of education and career experience. So we're simply looking at a sort of a cohort effect here that over time means there are now going to be far more women who are moving up in the corporate economy and will be in positions to take on these roles. But this has taken time. If you go back still 35 years and think about the attitudes then, we're only at that point really probably beginning to proactively try and promote women and sort of issues of diversity and change that and change the pipelines. So this will change. Whether it sort of changes quickly enough, that's another story. But we believe business and corporate careers can be drivers of social mobility. However, the pipelines need to be carefully managed in terms of the access that we afford to people from all sorts of different backgrounds, the training that they receive, and the mentoring to help them progress up the corporate ladder. And we think this is narrowing at the moment rather than opening for reasons that John will talk about in terms of how career pathways have been structured. So the third lesson that I want to talk about is about values. And in particular, it's about families. And across our study, we see the profound role played by the family environment in shaping and enabling individuals who get to the top of the corporate ladder. Most obviously, we see this in CEOs of family-owned firms. So on the right here, this is Alfred Mond. He was the son of Ludwig Mond, the founder of the British chemicals giant Brunner Mond. Alfred, after a successful career in politics, followed in his father's footsteps, and he would transfer Brunner Mond to become ICI, the corporate giant of sort of British corporate giant of the 20th century. Much of that came from, his family's, training, their support of him, and then going into the family firm. William Lever, who of course sponsored our study, so thanks to him all these years later, here he is. He would start his career in his father's grocery store where he learnt the business. And he would take all of those lessons that he learned, and when he wanted to found his own company, Lever Brothers, the capital came from within the family. Lever Brothers, of course, will go on to become Unilever. Education, training, capital, particularly in the earlier parts of this century, this often came from within families and family groups and networks. But more than that, these individuals were infused by the values of their family. Lever and Mond were both Liberal MPs. They both had a deep, abiding belief in social progressive causes that they sort of would pursue both in a political context, but also in the companies that they founded and led and managed. They brought this progressive sense of values into how they led and created the companies. And these values and long-term perspectives that they had around sort of embedding them, we think are vital. Stewardship due to family ownership, these were all fundamental and critical aspects in the founding of corporate giants like ICI and Unilever. Now, the gentleman in the middle is perhaps who I think is one of the most fascinating characters in the book. I can almost certainly guarantee you will never have heard of him. He's a man called John Ellerman, and he was a highly innovative financier in the 1910s and 1920s. You could think of his business model like a very early form of private equity. His innovative approach to finance and management saw him build an empire in shipping, brewing, newspapers, property, and when he died in 1933, he left a fortune of £33 million. So to give you some context, that's 3 times bigger than the famed Guinness fortune that had been passed on about 5 or 6 years earlier. This is perhaps one of the biggest sort of transfers of corporate wealth from an individual that has been seen in Britain. It's an extraordinary sort of large fortune. Yet what happens next actually highlights the problems with families and family ownership. This is why this is such a great photo. John Ellerman Sr. on the left, John Ellerman Jr. on the right, his son, who of course he goes to great lengths to pass the business on to. Everything has been structured to enable a transfer to his son. Now, his son was very bright, very capable, and had absolutely no interest in business whatsoever. John Jr. would go on to become a world-renowned academic expert in rodents, and he would pursue his deep love of musical theatre. He ploughed a lot of money into it. He had absolutely no interest in business at all. He turned up at the AGM of the company as its chairman once a year, and that was about as much as he was involved in it. So the business empire stagnated due to this idea of the succession trap, And this is what we see. This is one of the key drivers of the problems with family business. So whilst on the one hand, we see a lot of benefit and value to family ownership in terms of sort of instilling values and a long-term perspective, there are these distinct problems that we see in terms of succession. And what we actually find across the century is the number of family-owned and family-run businesses rapidly declines. Certainly sort of from its heyday in the 1910s and 20s, we see this fall very quickly. In part, we see this because of rationalization and consolidation in industries. And we also see rising capital requirements that make it very hard for founders and families to compete and to successfully compete. But we actually think this is something that's then been lost in our sort of current state. The sense of stewardship and the values derived from families, we think, is something missing from the modern corporate landscape and something that, you know, we should think of in terms of this idea of a longer-term perspective and, you know, using values and purpose to drive our business outcomes.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to very quickly take us through our last 4 lessons. The 4th lesson we draw from our study is that the UK has been really poor at creating CEOs. Okay, a really lousy job at creating CEOs. After World War II, you'll see there's this trend, and apologies if you fall into one of these camps, of increasing dominance of the top role by accountants or engineers. Now, there's nothing wrong with accountants or engineers, but the way accountants and engineers were trained in the UK didn't make for great corporate leaders. Let us illustrate this with 2 CEOs that appear in our book. John Davis, who's the CEO of Rank from 1952 through to 1977. Rank, famously, the carry-on activities. Davis was an accountant. Norman Wisdom movies, they got into a lot of tolerance for risk. So he basically created this huge conglomerate. So when he left Rank, it was a mess because of his dislike of risk. Similarly, he hated research and development and innovation. He was an accountant. He wanted a payback period of 6 months, 1 year, stuff to come close. He was terrible at marketing. He didn't think you needed to sell your products. He had no idea of the consumer. And again, that was part of his training as an accountant. And finally, and with many accountants at the time, really poor people skills. He modeled his management style on Mussolini. He had his office designed like that of Mussolini. Sorry, Gaia. He had this huge desk, and on a Friday, he would just at random sack a manager to keep his managers on their toes. Again, that was common for accountants. Engineers. We've already met Leonard Lord, the British Motor Corporation, the largest exporter in the UK in the 1950s by some distance. They created, of course, the iconic Mini car. And the creation of that car tells us everything that's wrong with Leonard Lord as an engineer and as a CEO. He didn't believe in market research, okay? So there was no market research done on the Mini. He wasn't a fan of costing and accounting. It was all by intuition. What price are we going to charge for this Mini? By intuition. £496 is what it retailed at when it came out onto the market in 1959. He also didn't care about the engineering quality. He was a production engineer. He was all about efficient production to boot with the, what the actual Mini quality was like. So the Mini was produced in super quick time. It was really poorly built. There was lots of product recalls around it, but it sold really well because it was the it car of its day. So celebrities had one. So Princess Margaret was the first person to have one. Twiggy, Dame Margot Fontaine, the ballerina, and all 4 Beatles had a Mini. And in 1962, by 1962, it sold 500,000. And BMC, or British Motor Corporation's main rival, was Ford UK. And they were puzzled. How could this car be selling so many? And how could it be selling at £496, which is about 2/3 of an average income at the time? So Ford got its engineers to strip the car down and figure out how much it cost to build. And they found that the build cost was actually above what British Motor Corporation were selling at. They were losing at least £20 per car. It was a commercial disaster, and you can trace that all back to Leonard Lord and to his in the 90s as an engineer. Compared to other industrial nations, when you look at the UK in the 1950s and compare it to other industrial nations, and you ask how many of the top companies, CEOs, had a university education. Now, university education isn't everything, but it shows a breadth of training and a seriousness of training. Germany, France, United States, and if we were to have Japan up here, similar sorts of figures, 75% to 90% of CEOs have a degree. In the UK, it's 1/3. And it takes the UK until the 2000s to reach the point the United States was at in 1950. And when it comes to business education, we don't need business education. But look at other major industrial nations. France at the bottom, Japan, and then France again, United States, Germany, and so on and so forth. It took until 1964 for the UK to have its first business school. And even then, it took a lot of pushing from the government for Manchester Business School and London Business School to be created. Ireland, of course, I think Smurfit's 1991. Yeah, and Andrew Burke, former Dean of Trinity. When was Trinity's Business School founded? 100 years, okay. So, okay, so could be in here. But this idea that, the real hostility to business education. Okay, the number one question everyone asks us when they hear we've written about a book about CEPH, why are they paid so much? And let's try and answer that question. Here is the ratio of CEO pay to annual average earnings in the UK. So in other words, for 2023, annual average earnings in the UK are about £37,000. The average CEO of a top 100 company was earning 157 times that per annum, okay? And you can see here that when we go back to the 1960s, 1970s, the data for pre-96 is not great, but it kind of hovers about the 20 to 30 mark. Okay, so CEOs were paid 20 times annual average earnings back in that period. So why this huge run-up in pay during the 1980s? What we do in the book is really tell the story around the privatization companies. These companies that Margaret Thatcher privatized. So British Gas and British Telecom, for example, their CEOs before the companies were privatized were paid £50,000, £85,000. If you look then 7 years after or 10 years after, how much they're being paid? Huge amounts of money, okay? And you look then, what's the effect on workers? So worker pay didn't go up by as much as this, and indeed there are quite a few redundancies. So between 1983 and 2002, the CEO pay of formerly nationalized companies increased by 1,500% in real terms. Okay, so what's going on? Of course, there were backlashes against this. Some of you may be of my age and can remember the pushback from when Cedric the Pig Brown, the CEO of British Gas, was going to have another pay award, and the GMB union brought this saddleback pig named Cedric outside the AGM to push back against that. What's going on? So even today, so in 2025, 1 p.m. on the 4th of January, the average pay of a CEO of a top 100 company in the UK had surpassed what the average person in the UK is going to earn across a year. Okay, why does this happen? We still see newspaper headlines. Here's a really cheeky one from The Guardian. Martin Sorrell's pay package plunges from 70 million to 48 million per Martin. Why? Why this increase in CEO pay? We think there's three driving forces. First of all, there's the rise of a different social norm. We come out of World War II, it's all about trying to fix the country again, and this is the same across Europe. We're trying to rebuild. You can't have people being paid too much. But then come the 1970s, the same is true in the United States, you get the emergence of this superstar salary. And so all of a sudden, CEOs become these superstars. And we actually trace the pay of Premiership footballers through this period of time to see this superstar. That's one reason. Second reason, and the one that's maybe driving a lot of this, is deunionization of the private sector. So the private sector in the UK was heavily unionized until the 1970s. It's been essentially decimated in terms of unionization. And back in the day, in the 1970s, if a CEO put their pay up by, or their pay was put up by 20%, the union would be in saying, well, we want 20% too, please. So that kept a check on CEO pay. As soon as you remove trade unions, then you're going to get this decoupling of CEO pay from the pay of ordinary workers in the firm. And the final reason we think is that tenures are a lot shorter today. One of the things we trace in the book is look at tenures. If you've only got a 4-year tenure as a CEO, you're going to try and maximize your revenue. Finally, and I want to be very quick about this, corporate governance. So one of the things we've observed in the book across time is that CEO behavior deteriorates over time. So Fred Goodwin here on the very left not only destroyed Royal Bank of Scotland, you could say he and his cohorts destroyed the British economy, contributed quite a bit to the destruction here in Ireland as well. But we have noticed this trend, okay? And why is this the case? Well, one of the reasons that we think CEOs behave badly is that the underpinning legislation that enables corporations to exist is very liberal. Okay, so it's called the 1862 Companies Act. It's what affects your company law here in Ireland as well. It's a very liberal piece of legislation. Comic Opera by Gilbert and Sullivan critiqued that legislation. It's called Utopia Limited. They saw that basically give CEOs, executives, they could do whatever they wanted, okay? Lots of power. And so what we do in the book is then suggest some ways that we might go about fixing corporate governance. I'm not going to go through all of these, but things like anchoring pay, things like making CEOs stewards of companies, just like if it was a family owner or an aristocratic owner, corporate purpose. Everyone talks about this. Every firm in Ireland and the UK has a memorandum of association. That memorandum of association says, here's our explicit objective as a firm. But CEOs are never held to account for meeting that objective. They're held to account for the profits of the firm, but not what they say they're going to do in the piece. Competition, also a very important thing. Finally, another question we're asked a lot is what makes for a great captain of industry? The only CEO that we have in our sample that appears in the front cover of Time magazine is Thomas Lipton, whose parents emigrated from Ireland shortly after the famine and moved to Glasgow. So what makes for a great captain of industry? We think there's 4 things that we observe across our 1,400 individuals. They're smart. You want to get a firm from here today to over there in 5 years' time, that's an intellectually demanding task, devising a strategy. So they're smart. To implement the strategy, you have to be organized, diligent, and attention to detail. Okay? To implement the strategy, you need good people, so you need good interpersonal skills. And you also need to be driven by something. So it's not power, we typically find, it's not profit, it's about having a purpose that's beyond the company. Famous example, William Lever, what was he driven by? He was driven by taking soap to the working classes to help with cleanliness and health. That's what drove him. And many of the CEOs in our sample, that's what was driving them. So what does this mean for businesses? Best CEOs are typically insiders. There's a fashion for outsiders. What we find is that the best are insiders. And if you want to develop good CEOs in your business, you need to think about the talent pipeline. And you also need to think about broadening that talent pipeline so that you're catching all the talent that's in your organization. Thank you very much for listening. You can find out more about the book at this QR code. It's amazing what you can do when you're in your 50s with technology. You can buy it on Amazon. We've got copies for sale here. I ignored the protocol when I brought them over the border. So it's 20 euros or 17 sterling. And those of you who are doing some sort of arbitrage around that, feel free to arbitrage. But I'm going to hand over to Tom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Now, there'll be an opportunity to take questions.